Good morning, class. I apologize again for having to cancel lecture, and I hope no one ended up going to the classroom and didn't get my email from this morning. Unfortunately, the heat went out in my house, and I needed to be home to greet the technicians to get that repaired. Nevertheless, it is doable, and so hence you are watching it for me to give you a virtual lecture, and I can record it and you can listen along the way and still get the same experience. So my plan is I'm gonna break this into two sections. We're gonna have the first section on invaders, and the second section relates to pollution, and I'll record those as two separate talks. So last time we started talking about invasion as one of our big components to HIPPO. That was H would be habitat alteration. That's the biggest thing we need to worry about. But secondly is the idea about invasions. So we'll continue our discussion about that. When we think about invasions, there are 5 different characteristics of invasive species that we need to think about. And I think that this goes very well to asking, why are these species able to do so well? And so there's a couple different points that we can list that I think help explain that question. The first is that they are highly adaptable. They're often the general species, those that have that wide range of tolerance. They're strong competitors in the niches. So they can come into a new community, they can take advantage of the multiple resources that are there, usually disjointed from the predator base, and so they can take off and do very well. Second is that invasive species tend to have very high reproductive rates, so they produce many young. The more that are produced, the more likely they're likely to survive, and those that do so are well adapted to the environments they're put into, based on our previous statement. Our third idea behind invasive species success is that they tend to have very short generation times. This isn't 100%, but it tends to be the case. So when we think about generation times, we're just saying that's the time it takes for you to be born, to grow up, and then to start having kids of your own. So like human beings, for instance, our generation time is around, say, 20 or 30 years, which is on average. Now, biologically, kids in human species can actually start reproducing at, say, maybe 13, but socially, our generation time is more like 20 or 30. So for invasive species, they have the short generation times, and they can produce quite a bit, and that allows them to go into this idea too, that they're going to have a lot more young in the environment. They're going to be much more adaptable. There is the possibility too, when you have very short generation times, when you have a lot of reproduction, that there is the potential for large amounts of genetic change to occur as well. Evolutionary changes can turn over faster than a very long-living species. And so also for the idea about adaptation, maybe that invasive species was only slightly able to adapt to our environment, but if they can have very fast generation times, then there's the potential they could adapt very fast to our environment, and the whole system can take off. Fourth is the idea that there are very few or no natural enemies. It goes back to what I said before. You have very few predators, usually on the landscape, that know who you are, understand your role in the ecosystem, and that allows you to do much better. Lastly is the idea about dispersal. That for these species, because there's so few limitations, they tend to be able to disperse well. There's nothing really holding them back. And if there's that potential and they can move around well, then it's really a great key to establishing in a new area. When we think about invasive species, we can actually define them also within a cycle of invasion. And so let's look at how this process works. Number one is that a species is introduced to a new area. Once it gets into that area, then there's the question of, is it able to survive or not? And so there's the possibility it won't survive, and that invasive species is not successful in this community. In other cases, it is. If it is successful, then there is the possibility that it can reproduce. And then what happens to the offspring? The reproduced offspring could survive or not survive. So we sort of have a little bit of a loop here as a species starts to get going. Now, if it may be especially unsuccessful if there are longer lifespans and there's not as much room for adaptation. If there's faster reproduction, there's a better chance you can reproduce and you can actually get on the positive side of your invasiveness. So you could survive and you could be able to reproduce. And if that happens, then what we say is that you naturalize. There's naturalization to an area. That is, you get used to the area, and potentially even the ecosystem gets used to you eventually in time. If you're successful and you're able to reproduce and survive, then there's that potential for expansion. And so they'll expand their range, and then that can lead then to other individuals that are dispersing. They can keep going into new areas, and then that just goes back to that cycle. So there is our cycle of invasion that we tend to see with these species. A good question is, how did these exotic species actually get introduced at all? And the big one, of course, is human activities. And there is two ways that this can happen. There's intentional or accidental. So in the idea about intentional ideas, then exotic species are introduced on purpose, since people might find them, say, attractive, if it's a plant, for instance. Or maybe they think that it could be useful for some other purpose, say hunting. We talked before about the ring-necked pheasant in the United States. It's a hunted species, but it is not native to the United States. But for some states, it has become very well naturalized across the U.S. In other cases, invasive species are accidentally introduced. And so it is purely accidental. The species were basically hitchhikers along the way via some other mode, and here they come. So there's also the idea, too, is that they could be dispersed by other animals. It doesn't have to be just us that causes the introduction, the accidental introduction, but they could have tagged along with another species. So we're not always at fault. And then there's always the idea, too, that there are non-biological components as well. So like storms, for instance, you could have, say, a hurricane, and it could grab hold of, say, seeds and blow them up into the atmosphere, and they'd land in a new area, and they can take off that way. As an example of a purposeful introduction, we learned a couple days ago about there was a series of folks that wanted to bring in all the birds that were mentioned in Shakespeare's writings around the turn of the century, the late 1800s. And one example of that was the European starling. I mean, it's a very pretty bird if you look at the picture, but it is a nuisance bird. It is an agricultural pest. They breed very fast, and so they took off. And so the way it happened was that 100 of these starlings were brought over purposefully into Central Park of New York City in the late 1890s as part of this Shakespearean introduction. And then, in less than 100 years, the species has spread all the way across the continent, where they outcompete native birds for resources and are generally considered pests. And of course, this isn't just a United States problem. This happens all over the world, and increasingly so. Invasive and exotic species are becoming a global problem as we travel around the world. And we're traveling faster than ever. You look at this picture of airplane travel, with especially the yellow meaning even more common, and you see a lot in the US, but how much transportation there is occurring between Europe and America, Asia and America and Europe. These are hot spots, and so there's the real potential that things can move around. And this is an air travel picture, but I think it's very indicative of the fact that we are becoming a single entity on the global scale, and we are increasingly seeing homogenization. One really interesting point that was well taken about this invasive species story actually comes from this class. Back in 2006, when I was teaching this class, there was a student who was in the Delaware Army National Guard, and he was sent over to Baghdad, Iraq, as part of essentially Desert Storm 2 in maintaining peace in Iraq. And so he was sent to Iraq, and he amazingly felt, and he did feel take classes online while he was in Iraq. And it was really cool that at that time we were doing some outside field trips that year, trying it out, and we did bird. The students did bird lists. They kept track of birding, and he couldn't do that per se in the United States. But he said, "Well, can't I do that here in Iraq?" And so I said, "Yeah, why not? I may not know all the birds you're going to run into in Iraq." But I'll help you. And we found a birding guide, online birding guide for birds of Iraq that he could use. And what was really cool is he took pictures for us of what he saw. The thing that was amazing is that he didn't see very much at all. But what he did see were some very, very common representative things that we even know here in Delaware. So for instance, he saw a lot of these guys. These are the house sparrows seen around camp in Baghdad, Iraq. And these are the same house sparrows you see in parks in the United States. This is a European species, which became an invasive species in the United States, and also was not native to the Middle East as well, and it spread there. Second, he saw a lot of pigeons, just like we have as well. And so they were everywhere, and it's pretty amazing to see that pigeon sitting in a bombed out building. Another one that we don't particularly have here is the Eurasian collared dove, and it's something that originally came from Sri Lanka and Myanmar, but spread into the Middle East and spread into Europe. And there is increasingly signs of this starting to pop up in the southeastern U.S., so it's very possible this is going to become, in the next couple decades, a new invasive species across the United States, taking over niches that exist for other doves or pigeons. So a really neat example to see that from one of our students in 201. The question of all this invasive species becomes, what are the environmental impacts of it? And the environmental impacts can really depend on the species involved and on the environment itself. Humans have usually brought them, and they're usually adapted to disturbed environments where humans live. So we understand that issue. And then when we think about real impacts, I think it's important to recognize that a lot of times these invasive species don't cause a lot of problems. I'm sure that ecosystems around the world are constantly being tested by non-native invasive species, and they just don't take for whatever reason. The ecosystem does not give them the basics that they need to take off. And so for a lot of times, I think that there's actually very little impact on the environment. But some, and then there's always the possibility too that some are quite useful. I mean, agricultural crops themselves, most of them that we use in modern day society are not native to North America. We bring them and we take advantage of them. And so that's actually quite a positive. But for others, they are pests, and that's sort of what we're focusing on a lot. And there are different ways that we recognize that this can happen. The first is that there's always the potential that invasive species can cause economic loss. We understand that having a non-native species in a system can perhaps cause trophic interactions. What are the consequences of this species being present and disrupting what would normally be the case? And is there the potential that this can lead to native species extinctions? And does that have then a feedback on the trophic interactions themselves? And all of these are possible, and it really just depends. But it's certainly because there is the potential for some very bad things to happen, we take invasives very seriously, and hence why they really become our second on our list of critical concerns toward wildlife in the world. I want to give you some examples of invasive species just to drive this home. The first example is this thing called a chestnut blight. Chestnuts are a type of tree, and if you ever are in New York City in wintertime, you'll see roasted chestnuts for sale in carts. and what you see there is actually a non-native, a Chinese chestnut that is used to produce those chestnuts that you eat. But in North America, we had a native chestnut, and it was very, very common in American forests, especially in the East Coast. Um, However, in 1904, a fungal pathogen was accidentally brought into New York City, in New York, around the New York City area. And it came from Asian chestnut trees in the logs that were brought over for whatever reason. And the fungus was inside those logs. And so it escaped. Um, and it took off. And the American chestnuts had no defenses whatsoever to combat the fungal pathogen. And so it just absolutely decimated the American chestnuts across the United States. And it essentially made them all but extinct in the United States. There are lots of them around, and if you look like in the bottom right hand picture, you'll see cases where you'll see an American chestnut tree starting to grow, and it will grow to a couple feet high, and at that point the fungus pathogen still out there will creep into the bark of the growing new tree, and it'll kill it off. And all of these young chestnuts we're seeing are growing out of the roots of old dead trees, which can happen for decades upon decades. So it is continually trying to do this, but it can never take off successfully. So it virtually eliminated the American chestnut, and it was an awful decimation. There are of course trophic concerns about this as well. That because the chestnut went extinct, the best we can tell, there were actually 7 moth species that were specialists that fed on the chestnut, and they all have gone extinct to the best of our ability. I'm giving you both harms and benefits of my example here, and there really are no benefits to this invasive species coming in. It has just changed the ecosystem of the eastern forest. They are actively working, as an aside, to develop blight-resistant sort of subspecies of the American chestnut. They're making some very good progress. There's a series of test cases where they're trying them out in hopes that the trees can survive away from the fungal pathogen. So we'll see how it goes, but we're starting to make some progress. A second example is red imported fire ants, nicknamed RIFA, with R-I-F-A. And red imported fire ants are a nasty ant. They were introduced in the 1930s as a stowaway, is that best they think, on ships from South America. And today they're found all over the United States, sort of, as you can see from the map below. Where they are most often found is they like warm climates and they like wet climates. So when you look at this picture, the southeastern United States, where you see all the red spots, and in the center they're white, which means they're moist. There's enough water for them to go well. And behind all those points, you'll see a kind of gray area, and that's considered the United States Department of Agriculture's quarantine area, that they're very much worried. And so red imported fire ants have expanded across that range. It is probable or likely that they are expanding into those blue regions. We are in that zone of red to blue, and so it's unclear whether they'll make it into Delaware and New Jersey. But we're right on the edge of being a little bit too cold for them. You'll notice over on the southwest as well, the dots are black, which means it's not enough water. It's actually too dry. They exist over there, but they don't do well, except as you move into Northern California, where it starts to become wetter again, and then they take off more. So they are found all over the United States now. What is the harm of red imported fire ants? Well, a couple different things. The first is the sting is really painful, hence their name, fire. You get bit by these things, you'll know it. It is an absolutely horrible burning sensation to be bit by these guys, and they're voracious attackers of anything that might harm their colony. They are pests to agriculture and to households. They are threats to wildlife. They can actually kill young birds. if the birds are nesting on the ground where the ants can easily get at them, if the ants feel that they're a threat to the colony, or even in some cases the argument is that they're eating them and taking those nutrients back into the net for a nest for a queen. It's pretty scary stuff that they can kill and decimate an animal pretty quick. What is the benefit? Well, they do feed on other pest insects, but it's not really worth it. It's kind of a beast of an animal. So we're trying very hard to figure out ways that we can get rid of red-imported fire ants. A third example is something called a zebra mussel, and I'll show you a little clip of this in a second. In the 1980s, the zebra mussel arrived in the Great Lakes of the United States as a stowaway in the ballast water in ships from Russia. So what is ballast water? Well, see, ships take in water before they leave port, from a home port, and they put that water in the bottom of the boat, and it helps to stabilize the boat and minimize rocking, especially as you're going through a cross-oceanic travel crossing. And so that's the case. You bring in all this water, and then for ships that were coming from Russia and they would travel up into the Great Lakes, when you reach your destination, you'll release the water. You'll get rid of all the water. The boat will rise up. You'll bring in some fresh water from where you're at. But as a result, the zebra mussel, which was native to Russia, was in the ballast water, taken up there, brought here, and then dumped out of the ballast water, and it took off. They are extremely prolific, and they can move around very, very easily, and they stick to everything, and that's the real problem. Is that they can clog intake pipes, they can stick on the bottom of boats. And then we get into all kinds of different harms. So especially because they stick to things, you have the pipes that can get clogged up for water intake of cities that are along the Great Lakes, and now they're moving slowly into streams and other ponds away from the Great Lakes. They eliminate native mussel species that were already in peril. In fact, almost 70% of all the freshwater mussels are now threatened or endangered in these regions because of the zebra mussel. They have the potential to really change the ecosystem. As you have one single species that is dominating it, what are the consequences for ecosystem function? The one benefit of zebra mussels is that like all mussels, they filter water as they're taking in food. And in some areas, amazingly, because the zebra mussels are so prolific, they have actually cleared up the water, and that's good. And so you have the potential to increase biodiversity, but nonetheless, there is great concern that ultimately it comes down to it's a non-native species. There seems to be nothing that's taking control of them, and how far will it actually go? So I want to share with you a movie, hopefully this will work, about zebra mussels, just a couple-minute movie so you can see them a little bit better.
There's something therapeutic about the sounds of water splashing against the shore. But all is not well beneath these tranquil waves. Invasive zebra and quagga mussels are infecting many of our lakes in ways never before experienced or even imagined. Thousands of these invaders drop to the floor each time commercial fisherman Jeff Weborg releases his gill nets into Lake Michigan.
It's hard to imagine, but our scientist at NOAA, who studies life on the bottom, has estimated that there are over 4 quadrillion mussels on the bottom of the lake.
These destructive mussels blanket the floor of big and small lakes alike. They have invaded 20 states, lurking in hundreds of inland lakes and 6 major rivers. And they stick themselves to everything.
So if you take a look at a pipe that mussels have entered, now you've got a problem.
Utility pipes and machinery often get clogged with massive amounts of sticky mussels, and it's costing us millions.
Right now it's probably between 15 and 20 million a year to control them at the pipes.
But that's only part of the problem.
They can change the ecosystem in ways you don't want the ecosystem changed.
Hungry zebra and and quagga mussels are literally sucking in plankton, a critical part of the food chain and necessary for the survival of game fish. And the mussels have a voracious appetite.
A zebra mussel the size of my thumb can filter a liter or roughly a quart of water a day.
The only way these invasives can get into a lake is when a recreational boater or angler inadvertently puts them there. When traveling from one body of water to another, they either forget or don't know how to rid their boats of microscopic larvae.
Those larvae are virtually invisible to the naked eye. There's about 100 zebra mussel larvae in this vial.
The only prevention method is to clean, drain, and dry your boat every time you take it out of the water.
Make sure that you don't move water of any kind from one body of water to another. That means the bait buckets and the live wells and anything else that might be contained in your vessel.
It's the only way to stop these invasive aquatic hitchhikers, known as the silent invaders.
All right. A fourth example to share with you is kudzu. This is something that you may know something about. Kudzu was intentionally introduced in 1816, actually at the Japanese Pavilion at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. So in downtown Philly, nearby the Philadelphia Zoo, there was a international exposition there. And they brought kudzu in thinking it would be a neat decorative plant. But they had no idea that it would be released and it would take off as an invasive species. Kudzu grows very, very quickly, and it covers nearly everything. It's jokingly called the plant that took over the world or ate everything, sort of. And you can see cases like this in this picture. The top picture is actually a cabin in the center of that picture underneath all that kudzu, and of course down below where you see it covering a car. So you can understand why it is a plant that ate the South when it started to really take off, and it doesn't do as well in northern climates, and it did very well as it moved further and further into the southern climates. But it causes extensive damage since it smothers agricultural plants and gardens, and so it's extraordinarily hard to control, to eradicate, and it becomes of real difficulty for people. It can be done, but there is a cost to it. Now, is there any benefit to it? Well, yeah, there is. You have a very fast-growing plant that has the potential to stop erosion, so that's kind of cool. And also it was found to be useful as a cattle forage. But both of these are really minimal things that are not a big problem in the Southeast anyway. And so really there's just the concern that it's just dominates an ecosystem, and all of the life that you can imagine back up in that picture with the cabin, where all the life that was once underneath that is essentially gone. And so that's certainly not very good. A fifth example is the cane toad. We actually learned about the cane toad in our story about the cahao bird, that the cane toad had been introduced accidentally into Bermuda, and it was the frog that could smell fresh water and was going over to the Cahao Islands and using the nesting areas that Cahao was using. So the cane toad was actually originally throughout the southeastern U.S. and across the Bahama, Bermuda Islands, the southeast. It was actually initially thought that it could be used as a control agent for a beetle that was harming sugar canes. So that is known as the cane beetle. And they thought, well, let's be smart about this cane beetle problem that's really damaging our sugar canes. What if we could bring in its predator and naturally control the beetle? And so they did some tests where they brought the cane toad in, which it did, so they brought it in, but it took off very, very fast. Then the real problem is that what happened elsewhere. So they thought about doing this also in Australia. So the cane toad was brought into Australia also to take care of cane beetles and sugar canes, but it took off and it spread throughout Australia. And so this has been a real problem for Australia now, as is other places as well. What's the harm in it? Well, it's poisonous. It outcompetes native frogs. It dominates the ecosystem. The benefits are really none. And so this has been a real problem to how to control the cane toad. For those of you that are the Simpsons fans, you may actually remember a reference to the problem of exotic toads in Australia. Bart Simpson had called Australia Collect to ask about the direction that water flows around a toilet. And he ends up having to go to Australia, and he accidentally brings a toad along with him, and then it takes off uncontrollably. So it's a nod to the cane toad problem. But of course, just for fun, also Australia gets its revenge, and it brings back a koala bear back to the United States. Ultimately, the cane toad has not been a great controller. I have that in my benefit. It hasn't. It was a controller ever so slightly of the cane beetle, but not well enough. But the cane beetle itself has never really been controlled well, and so it's been sort of a loss across the board. Trying to deal with exotic invasive species is a real difficulty. In the United States, control and damage costs as much as $140 billion a year, just trying to take care of all of the different things that can be of issue to us. So we have some different ways that we can think about invasive species. We can try to prevent them. We can try to eradicate them once they're here, or we can just try to control them. And so let's look at each. The idea about prevention really is the best case scenario in dealing with invasive species. If we can just stop this on the front end, that would be huge. It goes back to that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And this is absolutely true when it comes to invasive and exotic species. It's much easier to stop it before it ever takes off, right? The government agency that's responsible for monitoring invasive and exotic species is the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, and then APHIS, which is short for the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. And so they perform inspections at ports of entry. More than 80,000 ships, more than 400,000 airplanes are searched every year. 1.8 million cattle, 2.7 million swine, 44,000 sheep enter the country every year, and they have to be searched. And so that's something that USDA APHIS will take care of. We also have to look at tires. 2.8 million used tires are imported in the United States every year, and Asian tiger mosquito larvae are found in the water that's collecting in those tires. So the tiger mosquitoes are now becoming widespread in the southeast and have been responsible for transmitting dengue fever, along with eastern equine encephalitis, which also can transfer over into humans. The other thing that USDA APHIS can try to think about is quarantines, and there's a chance for them to examine animals, especially when there's really bad cases. For example, mad cow disease, which we talked about before, is very similar to our chronic wasting disease and has been a problem for different points around the globe. There have been moments where, for example, in England or in Japan, where they've done lockdown when they see mad cow disease coming in from certain countries. They can try to sterilize the ballast water, going back to that idea about the zebra mussels. And the APHIS also plays a role in regulating and restricting the planting of invasives and exotic ornamental plants as well. And so even the University of Delaware's Botanical Garden plant sale catalog will indicate which plants are native to encourage local gardeners to make good choices for the environment, and then others that are non-native. And so it's just something to give some thought to. And so there's been a real push in recent years with federal, state, and local agencies, along with private organizations like the University of Delaware, that are trying to assist to make good recommendations, teach us as gardeners about non-native species and how we can improve on it. The second thing we can do is eradication. And eradication is very difficult. It's expensive and it's time intensive. And once a species becomes naturalist, naturalized to an area, trying to get rid of it and find every little corner that species is very, very difficult. So, for instance, kudzu, removing kudzu on just 1 square mile of land costs about $130,000 over a 5-year period. That's pretty brutal for just 1 square mile of kudzu removal, to stay ahead of it. But it grows so fast that that's really very difficult. And I think realistically that eradication is only feasible when you have islands, whether it's a true island surrounded by water or it's some kind of island of land. So maybe it's a park surrounded by suburbia. That's possible, and it would help too if you can do this eradication really, really soon after invasion before it takes over. So that is one possibility. Otherwise, eradication is very difficult. So then the last idea is control. There's various types of controls that are possible if the prevention and the eradication have failed. And so there are some ideas that we can think about. The first is chemical controls. Chemicals include pesticides, such as insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, poisons. And these may be effective against invasive species, but also the problem is they may be effective on non-target species, that is, species you didn't intend for the insecticide, herbicide, or fungicide to hit. So that's always sort of a nasty problem. When we think about chemicals, they'll kill all insects, even beneficial ones, and so trying just to spray to kill certain ones can be difficult. The second is mechanical removal. So mechanical means physically removing species. The only problem with mechanical control is that you're physically removing species. So in a way that's good, but it's also possible that your activities are more than likely able to disturb the environment as a whole. And so does that make other parts of the environment vulnerable because it is slightly disturbed? That's always a possibility. And the other thing that could happen is if you don't do a good job of control, it's kind of you're only half-heartedly doing it. You're leaving maybe some roots behind. Maybe you're kicking up the seeds as you're pulling the plants. It's possible that you're in fact actually causing more spread of the species than you ever intended to, and so that's an unfortunate consequence. Just to give you an example, garlic mustard is a common invasive species that was introduced from Europe by settlers that were looking actually for a good salad green to eat. And you can eat garlic mustard as a salad green. But it is an invasive species. It produces tons of seeds that are easily moved by humans and wildlife, and it can just take over forest floors. The best method for dealing with small infestations of garlic mustard is by hand pulling the entire plant, root and all, for disposal in plastic bags that can be dumped into landfills. And so sometimes you'll see local clubs, gardening clubs perhaps, or local parks will ask for volunteers to do a garlic mustard removal in the spring usually, before other plants are growing, and you won't harm them. Other cases that they can do large herbicide sprays, but again, you got to hope you can do that in the spring, and you're not going to impact other species. There are various types of control that we can think about as in addition to chemical and mechanical, and one is something called biological control. In biological control, natural enemies of the pest, including the predators or parasites or the disease, are used to manage or control the pest population. And this may be an effective measure, since in its new home, the exotic species has no natural occurring enemies. But again, we have to find predators, parasites, or diseases that can attack them. And where do you actually look for the best biological control of these agents? Well, so the best thing you could do is you would look in that invasive species home, the place of origin where it once had natural enemies. So that's pretty cool. But the problem is then you are intentionally bringing in another exotic pest species, potentially pest species, that could become a real problem. So in a way, it's kind of like cane beetles and cane toads, that we introduce one thing and then we introduce its predator and then the predator takes off. So there are serious risks that go along with biological controls. As you know, any of these biological controls could escape and become pests. So that's a real issue that go along with it. Now, if we can find biological controls that don't have secondary consequences, they themselves don't escape, or they themselves don't start attacking other things, then maybe we have a winner. But it takes an awful lot of research to try to figure out who these biological control agents are and what are going to be the impacts on the natural environment that we have purposely introduced something. So let me give you some examples of biological control. The first is something called a cactus moth. The cactus moth was released to control the prickly pear cactus in Australia. Prickly pear was a non-native species that was introduced into Australia. We have them throughout our Midwest and Southwest. A fairly low-lying cactus that grows in grassland areas. So you could go out to Kansas, for instance, and you'll see them out in pasture lands. From a livestock component, that's not great to have these cactus underfoot, and that they can also, they're not edible, and so they can start to dominate an area, reducing forage. So for Australia, they found that the cactus moth was a reasonable biological control agent that in theory did not, and they tested it, did not have serious consequences to the rest of the environment, but would focus on basically being a specialist on eating the prickly pear. And so to this day now, they've reclaimed 6.5 million acres of rangeland in Australia. Pretty cool. But there is a but to many of these things. The cactus moth, although successful in Australia, was accidentally released into the United States. And once it was in the United States, it wasn't a non-harmful species, but it actually is eating native rare cactus species in southern Florida. So now we have a new problem to deal with this cactus moth in the United States. A second example in Australia relates to rabbits. Rabbits were introduced into Australia from 1859 to 1875, and the introduction led to environmental devastation as the rabbits devegetated the land. You can go on YouTube, for instance, and look up rabbits in Australia, and you'll see these movie footage where you'll see just thousands of rabbits in mass working their way across the landscape as if they're like cattle. It's really crazy what happened with the rabbits in Australia. One way that they've started trying to successfully reduce hare populations in Australia is through a disease. They found a pox virus, myxomatosis, that controls the rabbits. It's a fatal disease by having basically many skin tumors, kind of a nasty thing. But it does control the hares without any secondary consequences, and so this has been a huge help to the Australian people. Trying to figure this out about what's the consequences of introduced species as a biological control is a tough thing, and so entomologists around the country engage in this, and we here at the University of Delaware, in fact, have a very active effort to find biological controls. Dr. Huff Goldstein in the entomology department has done a lot of research over her career looking for biological controls of some critical invasive species. And so, for instance, kudzu. Dr. Huff Goldstein has tested several insects that have been tested for their effectiveness in controlling kudzu. So they've looked at two beetles. You see them here that came from Asia, but both of these two beetles, because they test them on a lot of other secondary plants in the lab where nothing bad could happen, they found that both of these beetles like the taste of soybeans. And that would be awful if we release those beetles into the environment and it could decimate the soybean crop of the United States. So as a result, those were checked off the list and were never released in the United States. Perhaps a more successful example that Dr. Huff Goldstein's lab has been working on is something called myelaminet weed. Myelaminet weed was an exotic plant that escaped after being planted as an ornamental. And so it looks like you can see in that bottom left-hand picture there, where it looks a little bit like kudzu, but the leaves are much smaller. And you can, and it's taken over, especially the Midwest, and it's been slowly expanding more and more outside of, not the Midwest, of the Mid-Atlantic. It's expanding more and more. So Dr. Huff Goldstein's lab has looked at 2 beetle species that have, and they found that they were not of real concern, and they have been very successful in trying to control Myla minute-weed, so we're making good progress in controlling this. We're just sort of in the early stages of seeing real success for this. But the signs are good that they have found a beetle that only feeds on Myla minute-weed and weevil, and will not harm the rest of the ecosystem. So in some cases it's possible, but it takes a great deal of work. All right, I'll stop this part of the lecture here, talking about invasive species, and then I'll pick back up with a second movie talking about pollution as our third component of the hippo crisis.